So this is Sean Robinson of Pioneer Square Labs. Um, and so let's talk a little bit about his background first. You're an astrophysicist who then got into the venture capital and startup scene. How did that happen?
So this is an interesting career arc, and it's one that I think you see a lot in what I'll call the old guard in like current AI research. By that I mean we were all doing something else when the latest wave broke. So if you go through the history of artificial intelligence, it's had several fallouts over the years where it was overhyped, promises weren't really brought together. So the current wave of AI, and I apologize for going around the world like this, but it really will make sense by the end. The current wave in AI is really like the second or third big bloom of hope in the AI world. And so before that, I was in graduate school and I ended up doing a PhD over here at University of Washington in physics, in particular like computational astrophysics was my thing. I worked on this thing called the Gamma Ray Large Area Space Telescope. Very cool experiment that now that it's actually flying, the tradition is to rename it once it doesn't break. So it's the Fermi Space Telescope, and it's basically a big refrigerator box full of a very special sort of telescope that has very dense layers that will take extremely high energy photons and convert them into a positron and an electron. Then we track the positron and electron and try and reconstruct where the gamma ray came from. And by doing this with a very sensitive piece of equipment, which is in low Earth orbit right now, we're able to get a lot more information, a lot more depth about the early universe, and certainly things that are giving off really high energy photons, which tend to be black holes and other intense objects very far out there in the universe. So I did that work, but when I was doing it, since the instrument wasn't up yet, we saw mock-ups, we worked on the design. A lot of my work was computational simulations. So the classic thing back then, if you said, we're going to do computational modeling. I go to somebody circa 2001 and I say, what's computational modeling? Well, the ideas of machine learning did already exist, but a lot of the real bedrock usage of it was more what I would call the simulation analysis modeling low parameter space world. What I mean by that is, say I want to model inside the sun and I want to guess what's inside the sun, but it's too far away, too expensive. We can't just go to the sun. We can. We now send probes to it, but it's at phenomenal expense, and you get a little bit of information. But we still can't really tell, say, what's at the center in any real way. But what we can do is say, I have a bunch of people in a room who know everything about fusion, everything about gravitation that we understand. And so I can make, let's say, a model of the sun with just a couple of free parameters to it. So let's say I don't quite know exactly the ratio of hydrogen to helium, and I'm not 100% sure of the total mass, but I have it within a range. And we did all this from physics knowledge, right? So we make our model, and our model has a lot of foreknowledge. It's like, well, I start a big ball of gas and it falls in, and then it starts to do fusion in the middle, and that produces an outward pressure, and they balance, and so therefore I have a star, the star emits. So I make my model, and then in my model, there's a virtual me on Earth with a virtual telescope looking up at the sun, measuring it. And then I go outside my office and point an actual telescope at the sky and measure it. And then I start tuning those couple parameters in my model until those things match. And then I say, yep, those are my best estimators for the couple of free parameters that I had. So that was computational modeling. I don't want to say back in the day. There's a bunch of different threads of this, but for a hard scientist, somebody who is going to work in a lab or on a physical piece of machinery with a lot of scientific foreknowledge, that was computer modeling. So turns out there is like almost zero money in astrophysics. So I finished a PhD on this, and I sort of look around for potential jobs, and one of the biggest employers, also a really great place to work, I totally endorse, is the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is kind of like the best kept secret. Like if I said Los Alamos or Argonne or Oak Ridge National Laboratories, a lot of people know who those are. The one that's closest to us up here in Seattle is actually the Pacific Northwest National Lab, headquartered mostly in Richland, Washington, which is sort of, I don't know, center east south-ish, nearest Walla Walla, Washington, in a place called the Tri-Cities, the three cities next to each other. So I went out there and did basically exactly the same thing, which is simulating detectors, doing optimizations on how those detectors should look, with a lot of scientific foreknowledge and packages that just had a few free parameters. I did that for several years on terrestrial detectors. So as you recall, one of the big things after 9/11, everyone was very concerned about national security. One aspect of that was turning protecting the borders from any kind of potential radiological incident or event. So as a prophylactic against that, those possibilities, we've instrumented, I think, basically all the borders in the US now with radiation detectors. So some of that was my work. A lot of that was optimization, figuring out where they should go, how many we needed, and so forth. And then we started to turn a corner. I remember vividly at this time, I'm sorry that I'm weaving so much of like the AI world into what I did, but
no, this is fun. This is interesting.
It's hopefully valid because my trajectory is very much influenced by what happened at that time. There was a time when like neural nets were very much on the outs. It a little bit esoteric, but people had declared earlier on that they didn't think that neural nets could reference any arbitrary function. In fact, let me explain what I mean by that too. So if you
So what was hot at that time, and why were neural nets on the outs then?
So as I recall, the first stuff that I really got into is things that you'll find in really turnkey form in like a package like Python scikit-learn. It's stuff like random forests and support vector machines, logistic regression, stuff that we kind of think is not highly complex. But that's part and parcel of the reason why I brought up all of this old modeling is because now there's a new modeling. If you go to people and say, well, what's computer modeling now? A lot of them will say, it's neural nets, it's machine learning and so forth, which is true, but it's also the opposite end of a spectrum. So if one end of the spectrum is, I know a lot about science, I know just a few things I don't know, and I'm going to tune them up and try and guess what they are. The opposite end is I know nothing, and I want to make a model that therefore has to be completely generalizable. So a good example, I want to recommend a movie to somebody. Now, there's no room of experts who just know, who know everything about movies. Maybe there are, but they still can't enumerate it all. So there's no one general great model that's reproducible about what makes a movie an action movie, for example. Yeah. You can things right on the line. And so in despair of doing that, we instead say, well, what if instead we made some models that know basically nothing from the get-go, and instead basically they have a lot of free parameters instead of just a few. And those couple of parameters allow them to twist and turn and take sort of any shape. And then we're going to take this massive data that we have. And that's really the change that was happening as I was, I left graduate school, finished my PhD in 2004. So between them and a decade from then, we had this information explosion that put us in a very different position. Many of the times we're now looking at the situation and going, I've got a mountain of data about who like what movies, but I don't really know what a movie is or how to use it in any direct way. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take this model with thousands of parameters potentially, or just many, and I'm going to pour data on top of them until the generalizable model starts to take the shape of what I call a synthetic expert. And if that's not clear, maybe I'll do another sentence on that, because essentially what the simplest way to do this without a whiteboard is to take a simpler model that's still generalizable like that. So if I look at like a simple multiple linear regression, right? And you come into, let's say, you come into a hospital and I take your blood pressure, your weight, your age, your sex, and all the other stuff that I know about you. Then I guess, does this person, let's say, pre-diabetic, that I should give them a test and devote some resources to seeing if we can help them with that. In many cases, you could get experts in a room who could give you about some of a model. People would say, well, blood sugar is this and their weight is that, I would recommend. But A, there may be parts that they don't know because the research hasn't quite pulled them out. And B, it's hard to be very specific, so people give sort of generalized guidelines. But what would be great is if we looked at 1 million people and got their age and blood sugar and weight and all that stuff. And then for all those 1 million people, we had checked, is this explicitly with the test, is this person pre-diabetic?
Mhm.
Now, if I wanted to model that, it's going to be hard for me to do the many experts low parameter model sort of thing. But what I can do is generate a model that's generalizable. So let's say that I'll make one and I'm going to say a certain constant times your weight plus another certain constant times your age plus another certain constant times all the other stuff
Yeah.
equals how diabetes-ish you are right now.
Mhm.
And then, so this is the one of the simplest, machine learning models is just a multiple linear regression. And
Mhm.
the idea is I take that model and I put it on the table and I say, I'm going to pour data on top of this. I'll say, all right, person one had these stats and they were not pre-diabetic. Person two had these stats and they were pre-diabetic, and so on. And then my goal is to twiddle all the knobs that I have, which are all those cofactors I just put on those things,
Yeah.
that this would most predict, they would do the best at predicting the pre-diabetic state. And
Mhm.
then this is called the training phase.
Yeah.
So I've made a model that now works in some sense for everything. Whatever, I could have put anything in there. How many traffic accidents you have and your age and your likelihood of having another, right?
So you dump in some data basically, and based on the data set that you're put in, height, weight, age, or for traffic accidents, we could put in some other data points like, speed of car, maybe color of car, weight. You can calculate some outputs without actually building a specific model for whatever the thing is. You just get a statistical averaging of sort of, these people with these characteristics or these data points with these characteristics look like they will do these things. Would that be sort of
Yeah,
a
I
higher
think
summary
that's
or?
a good way to put it. Like, ideally, and you can imagine doing this as a human expert as well, if the dynamics were not too complicated. Like, if I only had two things, let's say I just had your age and your weight, and let's say for the sake of argument, if I put those on a graph, up and to the right is going to be, you're older and your weight is higher. And let's say statistically more people up there have diabetes or than don't. So at some point, if I then labeled all the people, I put everybody into that scatter plot. So everyone has an age and a weight. I'll put them all in the scatter plot and I'll color all the people who have pre-diabetes red and all the other people blue. You can imagine an expert could look at that and say, you're up in this quadrant, so therefore your odds are high.
Yeah.
You're down in this quadrant, so your odds are low. So I'll assign, and if you imagine, you could go beyond that and say, I'm going to draw a line across that space. And on this side is the kind of high risk, on that side is kind of low risk. And there are other fiddly bits with that. I could take that line, once I've defined it the best, I could say how far you are on a perpendicular path from that line is how high your risk is, let's say.
Mhm.
And so machine learning is really just that. Most of what we call supervised machine learning, which is a lot of it, boils down to that. I basically take all the data that I have, I put it in a space, but the space can often be many dimensional, very complex. I've said that that's in 2 dimensions because you can visualize it, but
Mhm.
often this is going to come, age, weight, height, background, blood sugar, all this stuff. So now I have an n-dimensional space. I still have to define some kind of manifold through that space that will
Yeah.
define high risk versus low risk. And so all the machine learning techniques, most of them anyway, that you hear about, are trying to solve that problem. That I don't really know anything and I don't have a room full of experts, but I got a lot of data. So let's put it in some kind of space. And often the confining it to a space like this is called feature engineering. You'll find that there are some of those that don't help at all. For example, if I said, well, what's your country of origin? Might
Yeah.
not matter if it's a pre-diabetes. So you have to figure out, well, that one doesn't matter, throw it out. And there are a bunch of techniques to do that, but essentially the process of machine learning is doing that kind of calculation, figuring out figuring out uh, to wit, what you often do is segment that data. So I have a huge pile of data. Everybody came in, they got the test. I'll take a third of it and put it behind my back. Do this entire training process with it
Mhm.
to such that it would have most predicted the pre-diabetic state. Then I take the model and put the data that I had behind my back in there and say, okay, how well would this have done? It's sort of the acid test of saying,
Mhm.
this data didn't go in to train. So this is in some sense what I would have seen if I kept on trying to use the model in the real world. And then you see how it does. So
Yeah.
there are a bunch of techniques to bring this down, but that sort of brings me back to my life, which
Yeah.
is somewhere basically in between '04 and 2012, I'll say. A lot of these things were coming to the forefront. So the neural net issue was that hopefully, if I get this wrong, please forgive me, but it was declared that the neural net wouldn't necessarily be able to represent every set of dynamics. In particular, I think it was the XOR function. That if you made data using an XOR function, a neural net wouldn't do it. But that was a single layer neural net. And at some point, again, I hope I'm not getting this wrong historically. I'll go look. But at some point around that time, people figured out, no, it actually will reproduce whatever you want as long as we stack them together. A neural net is just another one of these things. Like the multiple linear regression model that I said is just a lower parameter version of this same concept. There are a lot of... to talk about what modern neural nets are would take a really long time. But the basic idea, before we start talking about convolutions and image recognition and dimensional reduction, all that stuff.
So let's go back to your story. This is the techniques that were sort of out between 2004 and 2012, you were saying.
At least
they got hotter again, or?
I'm trying to remember when the XOR thing was proved. I think it may have actually been it may have actually been when I was in grad school that they sort of figured out that it would work. But that gave rise to this thing called deep neural nets that took a while to kind of take off. And when we realized the power of them, they started to take over from a lot of these other techniques. They're very, very good at a set of problems, generally where it's difficult to talk about convolutions without drawing something. But suffice to say, for the moment, we'll probably get back into it. But for the moment, they started to be dominant in a couple of areas. One of them was like image analysis and recognition, image segmentation, all that sort of thing. And others were, and natural language processing ends up employing a lot of these things as the best tech that we have at present. So what happened was that I was working at the lab. I was doing, a lot of nuclear physics and nuclear simulations. And because my role was broad, I also started working with other groups who were doing stuff like, social media analysis in the sort of earlier days, and, analysis of the online space and some other stuff. And so I was exposed to these techniques at first as this idea, and I remember actually sort of rebelling against them a little bit. And this is probably something you'll see from folks who were in research before they entered this world, or folks who were in research before it. As I said, that's not really modeling, right? I look at this as a concept and go, yeah, but you don't really know anything. You're just throwing data at the wall and like hoping that you make a thing that has the shape of that data.
Yeah.
But it turns out that they're powerful enough, and more to the point, the world is now full of those problems. Problems are, I know almost everything, but just a couple things are very academic in nature, but problems where just basically the heart and soul of why I'm here at Pioneer Square Labs right now is that the world is now just replete with these problems where we don't know a lot, but we have a lot of examples. That just happens again and again in the business world, in the industrial world, every kind of optimization that you could imagine doing, things where, I want to know if, a person is happy or sad by looking at them or something. And I'm going to make something out of whole cloth. We didn't do this, but let's say I want to make an app that periodically turns your camera on, and if it can see you, it sees if you're happy or sad. And let's say over the long term, if your sort of affect is going down, it sort of reminds you to take a break and drink water or something. I made that, right? But you could imagine doing that, especially as cameras become more and more ubiquitous. And
a little too ubiquitous, but yeah.
And it's exactly the sort of problem where if you went at it in the old way, you would have to go, read up on like micro expressions and figure out, what's what. Or we just get a large example of people trying to look happy and trying to look sad, or trying to look frustrated or stressed. Figure out basically what bins those fell into, and then essentially feed it into a large convolutional neural net and say, all right, from now on, every time you see a face, I'm going to ask you what the affect of that face is. And we didn't really have to know things like what the microstructures of muscles in the face or the intuitive response to like emotional stimuli are. We could just kind of say, look, I got a million of these. Why don't we just make a thing that guesses for the million and first what they're feeling?
Yeah.
And that is so powerful. It's so transformative of the business world at present, that it's becoming a dominant technique for a lot of new ideas. And it's not really even slowing down yet. I think there'll be a time when a lot of this is compartmentalized. Certainly a lot of the old stuff that I was talking about, doing random forests, or trying to use different regression techniques and tell the difference of them. In the early 2000s, a lot of this was very hand-rolled. You're sort of making your own stuff. And you have to be very specific about knowledge in a lot of that space. Now, thankfully, a lot of that early stuff is very well canned. If you want to take all that data that I just said, all the data from, let's say, a hospital, if you have it, or whatever you've got, and you want to run a random forest technique on it so that you can make a thing that predicts the 1,000,001th example answer. Yeah. That's like just a couple lines of Python at this point. Like data ranking is actually far harder, than running the algorithms. You still need to know what you're actually doing. So it's not quite at the fully automated, toy level where I could just hand it to anybody and they can do it, because the outcomes can still be opaque. The features that actually went into it versus the ones you threw out versus the ones you changed is sort of still a matter of both art and science. But we're getting to the point quickly where for a lot of things, stuff like customer segmentation in large business or medium-sized business, it's an article of great interest for a lot of people, as you can imagine. Everyone wants to have very targeted ads. They want to communicate with their customers in a way that customers like. We're turning the advertising world from this sort of sticky, awkward thing that everybody just had to sit through. You're watching or enjoying whatever media, and then there's just a random commercial for something you don't care about, into something that, in the end, people will probably buy into all right.
Yeah.
And as evidenced by, you remember ads, I'll say circa like 2001 or 2002. And and they seemed relatively scattershot. Like maybe you were watching television back when that was a thing. And
indeed, I was watching television back in those days before the computer was ubiquitous.
Times when people had television that just took us to anyway. But you were doing that, and ads were very scattershot. Like they were guessing based on what you were watching and when you were watching it, and they were kind of okay. But now I think somebody sent me I happen to do a bunch of like live action role playing and other like tabletop role playing stuff, and so at some point I got a Facebook ad that was just for like foam arrows to put into a bow so that you can like have them, so that you can be an archer at like live action play events. And I'm like, that is so incredibly specific that if you showed like 10,000 people, maybe 2 of them would actually be on the radar, but they found that I got it right and sent it to me. Now, in a sense, it's still advertisement, but they're doing a good job. Like in my opinion, advertising can be a positive thing as long as we, turn down the volume up, turn the specificity up. If I'm actually showing you something that you're likely to like on a regular basis, now all of a sudden that sort of enmity of like, why are you showing me ads, can kind of drop down. So it's just, I don't know why I went on that whole arc, except to say that that's one of the things that's driven by the more modern techniques. And to do that, we needed to be able to look at a person without a perfect model of who they were and say, here's all the 80, 800, whatever things that I know about them. Let's guess if they're the novelty broadsword sort or the luxury car sort or both, or whatever they are.
Well, I need a luxury car to transport around my broadswords. Like, come on,
Possibly, or neither. You could be, a very different sort. And so trying to work that out can be a win-win, which is one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons I'm so happy where I am right now. Pioneer Square Labs is a really great place, and there's a lot of space here for those sorts of ideas. So my thinking, in a lot of ways, my thinking is kind of win-win. I'm very much an AI futurist optimist in this regard.
Yeah. So Pioneer Square Labs is this startup incubator in a sense. You're taking ideas, validating them, to my understanding, and then spinning out companies. So you've covered sort of the AI work that you're doing and the modeling for the different products. But as far as in a startup, what makes a good startup good? Or what makes a good startup, better than a bad startup? Just a few of the things that you've seen.
So this is from my perspective, from my side of the house, this is a really interesting question. So what makes a good startup good and a bad startup bad? So to get to that answer is to basically discuss why Pioneer Square Labs is such a good place. So basically, I'll start by saying what we do, and then it'll fall out of that answer, which is basically, so we're a startup studio primarily. There's other ways to engage with people, but basically, what we do is, so if you wanted to start a startup all by yourself, no incubator, no nothing, what you have to do is first quit your job and go to your basement, start building a thing. Then you got to convince your 2 or 3 other good friends to quit their jobs for no pay and go work in your basement with you. Then hopefully in whatever 6, 8, 12 months you have basically something close to a minimum viable product, or at least sort of a prototype or a demo. You have some pitch decks, and whoever is the talkiest one of you will go and start sitting in with investors and saying, won't you please give us money? And that's such a pain point. Plus, you don't necessarily have, with you and your hypothetical couple of friends, you don't necessarily have all of the knowledge that you would need. If ideally, if you did that, one of you would be somebody who's started and run businesses before. Another one would be somebody who knows the market that you're going after really, really well. Another person would be a product-focused person who can absolutely bring the product vision together and do branding. Somebody would be able to make your deck and all your pitch deck and all your stuff really pretty. Somebody else would be like a super good design. I'm at too many people. So when people do this, they don't often have that full complement of stuff. And so the first thing that I think people stumble on in the general world is that there will be holes where they don't have that expertise in-house. So they just kind of do their best. You talk to people. So here at PSL, we sort of take the pain out of that by bringing company ideas up to the level where they're sort of near funding, and then we actually recruit founding teams. Generally, the CEO is like the primary get on that front, and we try and find people who have history with this thing, who are very deep in the area, who have a passion for the idea that we're coming up with. And essentially they, come in and start to command that ship as it goes towards funding, hiring, starting to build out the initial product and so forth. So what we do in the interim, which is the magic piece that I think makes the difference between sort of bad and good startups, if there is such a thing, is that we do this validation process from the idea point. So I like to say, I come up with an idea. That thing, what I just said, an app that looks at you and tries to improve your mental health a little bit, or tries to catch if you're starting to have a really bad day and tell you, and so you can take steps. That hypothetical thing would probably die in the room.
That's pretty cool, but anyway, go on.
But that idea would probably die in the room that it started in. And the reason is because we have this intense validation funnel where we come up with ideas all the time, every day. Then we need to tick a bunch of boxes. And these are the things that I think turn a bad startup into a good one. All the things that you that are needs to have a successful company. Questions like, all right, well, I'm on the tech side, so I would say, is this technically feasible? If somebody said, I want an AI that does X, Y, or Z, that learns dog language, talks to your dog to calm your dog down. And I'd say, well, I need to go find out if that's actually possible. So I dig in the research. I try and write one. I get it, I put it in front of, everyone I know's dog, and I see. But that's only the technical piece. And that's what people see when they think about startups. But there are so many, that's what tech people think when they think about startups. There are so many more pieces to this. So one is market fit. If I say, well, are there actually people who want to talk to their dog and or who have dogs that are really excitable and they need something to calm it down by being another dog? That might not be the case. It might be that people would like that, but they wouldn't really pay that much for it. It might be that it's not technically possible. It might be that we just don't know the right fit. We can't identify the right person to be a CEO to really run this. And so essentially it could fail at the customer level, it could fail at the team level, it could fail at the tech level, and so we do, or sort of at the marketing level. So one of the reasons why we are starting to get this reputation of spinning out really good companies is that we go through all of those before it sort of becomes a real idea. Before we get a founding team, we tend to have, like, at least at the demo level, sort of at the proto product level, we have an idea of what the product is and will be. We have a ramp up. We've modeled the business and figured out if it did well, and this is the total addressable market. Here's what we think the response would be, which is a thing that investors always want to see, because they, their projections, you're maybe optimistic, but still projections as to if your business does well, what they will get back on their investment is like paramount. So we do all of those pieces. And as near as I can tell, most of what makes a startup bad, if there is such a thing, less likely to succeed, I'll say, is that they either didn't take all of those steps, they didn't go through like a proper validation process, usually because they're missing a person, or there is an aspect of culture which it's more ephemeral to me. It's harder to speak to, but I will say definitely things do better if people on the team are involved in that mission. One of, in my opinion, the greatest things we've done so far is this company called Boundless that helps people through the immigration process into the U.S. This is a process that can be complex, it can be adversarial, it can be very, very opaque. There are a lot of ways to lose if you want to look at it that way. And it's very frustrating. It's very scary for people who are going through it. And so there's basically one trusted entity now that we've created that helps people with that process. And there are, I think, a number of sort of services and semi-services that it offers in that regard. But everybody who's on that team is very invested in the mission. And that's probably if there is a hidden element, it's probably that. And then the last thing is probably timing, which I know there, people who make that a mainstay of their thinking, and it's still tough. I have a feeling about technical timing. Familiar with the hype curve that people will draw, where I'm trying to remember who came up.
The 10% adopters, 10% a little more mainstream, that crossing the chasm stuff, or
where the curve that I'm referring to is the one where time goes this way, and basically the technology comes out. There's some interest. There's an exponential growth and sort of hype around it. At some point, it reaches a peak. Where people start to become disillusioned. For example, this has happened with AI several times in the past, where in the earliest stages, and some before I was born, people would come up with this technology and say, we're going to have thinking, feeling machines that can replace humanity by 1970, and it didn't really happen. And so public interest waned, the idea started to fall off, and sort of funding fell out. That happens in our world as well. But because of exactly the time scale, my feeling is you have to, if you're doing startups and they're tech-focused startups, what you really want to do is surf the front edge of that wave. My belief is that the sweet spot is essentially just as public interest starts to fall out, because a lot of the really good work is being done in that stage. It's a very, very tenuous balance, because after the fallout, as you recall, comes this sort of long period of adoption in which the technical winners who made it through that bump now actually get to build the product out and make it into things that we use nowadays. A bunch of internet technologies did this as well. The entire dot-com bust in the earliest 2000s is basically the result of this.
I remember in the early thousands, like 01 or 02, you talk to anyone about the internet, oh, well, that was just a bubble, that was bullshit, and there was a bubble, there was hype, but that was also the time period when you saw like Facebook, and even the late 90s, I think 99 or 97 was Google just starting to get their stuff together. So that moment where in some sense a lot of people fell out of the market, but essentially somebody had sold the promise of tech in 2020 in 2000. And that's not quite what we got at the time, but we did eventually get it. And we saw exactly this pattern. There was a lot of fallout. A lot of people fell out of the market. A lot of people went home and did something else, got disillusioned with it. But even during that bust, sort of quietly, the people who would eventually be the giants in the next 20 years were still growing. And so my thinking is the right time is essentially right before the crash. It's like as public interest is starting to fall out, people are like, if I hear one more company that's going to do blockchain or whatever. That's exactly where my mind was going to.
And But whatever the promise of that is, if you have a solid idea, in some sense, get funded before the bump or before the fallout, and then ride through it with a good product, so that on the other end you're actually the stable choice, and then you sort of emerge into a market with fewer players, much more stable technology, with a thing that people want. And then it's another, maybe another 10 years or 15 years before people realize that, oh no, we really did do that thing we promised. It just took a lot longer than the public interest lasts. So that's my feeling about timing. I know there are others, I mean, certainly Boundless was done at a very good time. A situation for people attempting to immigrate to the US has certainly gotten worse, and it was right around the beginning of that time that we came up with the idea. And so it was the right idea at the right time, put the right team behind it. It was technically feasible. It just checked all the boxes. And so, so that did a good job. And so I guess that's my conclusion about good startups and bad startups, is they have that. And then, as near as I can tell, there's a fair element of probability. There seems to be some bedrock uncertainty that we can't get over, where you could have the very best idea at the very best time, everything is an A+, and it still fails. That just happens in this world. And the reason is because venture capitalism lives at one end of a spectrum of money. Do you want me to go into that at all? Or?
Yeah, totally. Let's go there.
So this is a thing that I found I could help people with some of the time. And again, my experience with the VC world is probably only about 4 years old. So there are much better experts to ask. But it's at the people always go to that extreme. They say, oh, I'm going to go and sit in with investors. I'm going to get VC money. And sometimes that is the right answer. The important thing to understand is that there is a spectrum of money where on one end is just bootstrapping. It's like, look, I took the money in my pocket. I bought myself a laptop or whatever I needed, a little piece of hardware, and I'm off to the races. We're going to make this thing work. And then it's even possible, in fact, people have done it, to turn that into a successful business with no external investments. But it's hard to do, because we think of especially tech forward things as having a big growth phase where all of a sudden you get everybody's eyeballs on it. So the next step is like traditional businesses. Like, you go to a bank, bank, I want to start a bar, and they say, all right, here's your $500,000 or whatever. Where are you going to put the bar? How much are you going to ask for drinks? What's the rent? All this stuff. And then they give you the money, and you go and you try and make your bar. And banks are basically looking for, consistent paybacks, because that's the terms that they work with. They're not necessarily going to make a huge amount, but they're going to make a consistent amount. And some people will default, and they roll that into the amount they ask for.
Well, they're one of the most risk-averse organizations on the planet. I mean,
it's tough. Like, that specific thing, if I went and tried to start a bar, I'm willing to bet that I could not. They'd look at me and say, for example, they're employing machine learning models. So they would look at me and say, Sean, you sure like, nice drinks or whatever, but you're not a bartender, so you need to hire one. You're going to hire the wrong one because you don't know what a good one looks like. You're not a business owner yet, or the stuff that you've done in the past has not been wildly successful, and you've never done a retail business. So what are you doing in our office? And part of that would happen even in, like, the 80s or 70s. People would still do that. Nowadays, a lot of that is the same kind of modeling I was talking before. People would put all my stats in and say, yeah, the machine says you're 85% likely to default on this. So if you want the loan, it's going to be an insane, interest rate. So basically it's a starter. But that's okay, because there's more flavors of money. So the next one, as I see it, is like crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, the sort of black sheep of this family, because it's weird.
Like starter stuff.
Yeah, it's weird and hasn't quite. I think it's finally found its niche. The idea of crowdfunding at one point was socially much more like, I have a thing that you'd like to see in the world, but I can't raise enough money for it. So if we all put a few dollars in a hat, that'll be enough for me to make the device or make the software, pay myself a year so that I can get it going. And it was a weird kind of like crowdfunded bootstrapping. But lately, although there's still some of that, crowdfunding's kind of taken a turn in the last 5-8 years. And now it's more like pre-ordering a product that doesn't exist yet. That on average, the stock thing to do if you want to make a product is to say, look, I'm asking you, the investors, to take on a risk. And the risk is that this never happens. but I'll do my best to make this product happen. So I have a cool thing. Here's the cool thing. Would you buy one? In some sense, it's the best kind of customer research because you're asking people, would you buy one? Would you actually put $1 on the table today?
Yeah.
Such that I promise you that if this sees the light of day, you'll get one. You're basically pre-ordering a thing that doesn't exist and has a possibility of never existing. So willing to take that minor gamble and spend your money, we can get the company off the ground. Beyond that, and I don't know if it's beyond or beside, is angel investing, obviously. And angels are their own people. They often have a myriad of goals. Some of them are more like super crowdfunders, where you'll talk to them and say, I think this would be good for people and it's a good idea. And they'd say, yeah, I like that. And I'm not necessarily going to care too much about the risk because I want to see it happen. Or I'm not necessarily going to ask for too much return because, I want to see it happen. Other people are basically more like smaller end VCs, which is what I see it as the far other end of the money spectrum, is venture capitalists. And sometimes I would joke and say this is how like the 1% play the lottery. It's not quite right. What they're really doing is many of them have a bunch of hedged assets at various risk levels, and this is kind of the highest risk, highest return one.
Yeah.
And the reason is because when you look at the stats for an individual VC-backed company, post-raise, so they've gotten a seed round, the odds that they fail, and I'm going to have to come around to what I mean by fail.
Okay, yeah.
They're like better than a half or like 90%, depending on how you look at what failure is. And I'm going to get this slightly wrong, so please go and look these stats up. But it's something like half of them actually just fold. Half of them are slightly more, just completely fold, don't return anything. All investments are lost. Maybe there's some IP that can be sold off, but like nobody really gets any money. Of what's left, it's something like half to 2/3 of them mostly return the investors' money. Where the investors did not lose, but they go to what we call an exit, which is usually the company either does an initial public offering, becomes publicly traded. So a lot of people pour money in, and that's how everybody gets paid back. Or they're mergered and acquisitioned by traditionally a large company, which is the classic thing that you think of. Oh, I built a widget that's so great that Apple wants it. Now Apple bought me. And that's how everybody gets paid back. So we're getting to pretty rare air once we start turning a positive profit. But in that rare air of the, whatever 2 in 10 left or something is, if I want to think about, 10 startups, like 5 of them just folded, all hands went down with the ship, everybody finds a new job. 3 of them basically give the money back to the investors. So they might as well not done it. The last 2 return I did this once and I can't remember. It's like the last 2 return 3 times the money and 20 times the money. And there are a few of them if I went 100 of them, there are a few of them that go to 1,000 times the money.
Yeah.
So really what's going on in the VC world is people are chasing that sort of crazy 1,000x return one. Everybody wants to hear you say, we're going to be the next Uber. If you fund us today, in 15 years or 10 years, we're going to be the next Amazon. We have a thing that's so awesome and so groundbreaking that while it's just going to start with 3 people in an office, 5 people in an office, getting funded for 2 years. In 10 years, it's going to be $1 billion industry, and we're going to IPO, and we're all going to make millions and millions and millions and millions past what we did. Everybody basically has to tell that story. It actually, and that's why I say it's on one end of the spectrum, because you have to walk in incredibly and believe it, and it has to be real. You have to say, look, if everything went perfectly, I would give you an infinite sum of money, essentially. And it's understood and acknowledged that everything is not going to go perfectly for almost anybody, but the average returns, when you factor in a couple of huge ones, a lot of failures, and so forth, is still quite into the positive. So it's extremely high volatility. It's extremely high return. And that thus ends the spectrum. I don't know if you have, with your background, you may have more slices of that rainbow, but those are sort of the ones that I know. And frankly, my advice to a lot of people who are getting VC funding is if there was anything prior on that rainbow that looks more like you that would work, do that one first. And do this one if it's the obvious only thing to do.
Yeah.
It's like big risk, big return, crazy new idea. It's going to disrupt a market. You can go in and confidently claim that. Then that's the time. And so as a result, here at PSL, most ideas fail. And I don't mean fail is a very good thing in this case. What we're doing is taking like 100 ideas that after the first room we talked about them in turn out to 10 ideas. We all put a little legwork against those 10 because they look like the real winners, and only one of them actually makes it through this validation winnowing. So by the time we spin out a company, there could have been 100, there could have been hundreds of moderately credible ideas that led to this thing. And so we can proceed with really high confidence at that point. So I guess that's why we're great. It's also why it's difficult because I am extremely spoiled in that. Well, I am because of this structure. I have the ability to operate in a new arena constantly. I'm thinking about image analysis. I'm thinking about facial manipulation. I'm thinking about natural language processing. I'm thinking about chatbots. Thinking about physical robots and reinforcement learning and all this cool stuff. But what we pay for this is that the moment that this is not going to be a good idea, that's not going to be venture scale, I have to leave it. And so, as a result, I wear a lot of hats. My job tends to be kind of frenetic. It's a blast. It's a roller coaster. But also, things fall off the edge of the table all the time. And those are the wages of going for VC funding.
Yeah. I guess the only thing I would add to that is that in my experience, the companies that I've seen do really well, like Avalara, where I was prior to their IPO, everyone loves to see that nice, hockey stick that's going up, and that what everyone forgets is that the first year or 2 or 3 or sometimes 5 is like flat of that hockey stick.
The bigger part, I guess.
Yeah, but it's like this. Everyone loves to see that, this quarter we were up 90% in sales and blah, blah, blah. And it's going to be great. But a hell of a lot of work goes in initially to make it work. And that's the point where you're, like Avalara, they got going in the early thousands, and they're a SaaS sales and transaction tax compliance company. And in the early thousands, they're like, yeah, it's like software that's a service that you purchase over the internet in like 03 or 05, when they got going. And people were like, you're doing what over the what to do what? Like, and of course, these days, it's a perfectly obvious, rational, this is the smart play. But back in those days, people were like, this doesn't make any sense. The interwhat, they just had a bubble. Like, this is absurd.
Yeah, no, I mean that's exactly the difficulty is that's like a very maverick decision to say, well, nobody buys stuff this way, nobody sells stuff this way, nobody can really attach value to it, but I believe, a team of people basically said, I believe that in the future this is going to be the new thing, and they operated on it at a time when, that wasn't necessarily perceived as a good decision, but clearly some people believed in them, and so so exactly that. So they blew up over time, and that kind of like the other problem is that sort of meteoric expansion is what's more or less expected. Like that traditional wow, I exploded, I tripled in size this year. Oh, next year too is kind of the signature for a lot of people of what's working well. Which is an interesting point. I think in some sense, this is turning around in the VC world a little bit. So the big concept for a while, for maybe a decade, as I understand it, seems to be like growth before all. If I was going to start a new social network right now, which I hasten to say I would not do, but if I was going to do that, my business projections and modeling would look like, well, we're going to burn money. We're just going to take a pile of money and set it on fire such that people are attracted to the smoke and stay there, right? Which is basically marketing and making the platform free, and making everything free. I'm just gonna burn money and time and money and time and money and time. And then the idea, what makes the hockey stick for them is that like in year 5 or something, all of a sudden there are enough people that the marketing becomes highly organic. People just tell other people to get on the thing, and now you sort of have a captive audience. Your thing is, and that kind of bet is, it's something you can only do with very deep pockets. You know, I'm literally saying, I'm going to take a seed round. I'm going to show you that we're growing. I'm going to take an A round. I'm going to show you that we're growing. I'm going to take a B round. I'm going to show you that we're growing. Okay, now we're starting to really be a household name. You know, all of a sudden you're like, whatever, $50 million in or something.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, the only positive signal that was there is growth. And since a lot of the real greats, you know, the real giants, I shouldn't call them greats. That's a matter of opinion. The real big ones, you know, I ended up doing this on the back of this extreme growth. Lately, the idea of a marketable real product in the earlier stages is beginning to come more in vogue. I think the perception is that this era where the internet fell out, nobody cared about it, so therefore a couple of sleeper hits came out of that. People are looking, they're still looking for that, but they're looking less for that over time, and more for products that actually would work well in the near term. You know, the idea I think nowadays is more like, I would make something that if they thought about it, Apple or Amazon would have made, but it's a big enough risk that I don't think they're going to do that. So I'm going to enter the market, protect my IP, come up with some good ways to do it. I'm going to start selling it. And if they don't buy me, they don't buy the company, I actually will start to eat business from them or produce a new market. And the idea of an exit is, well, you know, competition is like the best marketing for your company. So now I start competing with Apple and whoever else. And you know, and they come and eat me with an offer I can't refuse of money that pays back all my investors, or I actually start to become big enough that I'm now a rival in the market. And it's a scary thing to do also, but I see the VC world as turning slowly towards that as a picture. It's like, no, what you need to do is make a thing. The thing has to be something that people would actually want by itself, and the reason why you're going to exit is because you turn this into a product that people really put dollars down for. And somebody either really wants that power under their own umbrella, or you just take it all the way to the end, and you're the producer for forevermore. Yeah, I guess I'm not overselling that. But.
Okay, no, cool, thank you. So one topic I wanted to touch on briefly is, we're in an election year, and your expertise is in AI, and there's a lot of talk about either the Russians or chatbots or social media platforms or whoever or whatever interfering with the elections. So what are your thoughts on that?
They're somewhat complex. My feeling, first and foremost, my primary concern in all of this is the idea of confidence in the democracy we have. Like, that would be the thing. If there was nothing else, leaving aside my own personal feelings about it, if there was nothing else, I would want to ensure as much as we can that people retain faith in the democratic process. If that falls out, then we have significant problems that need to be addressed. I think people still have that faith, but they see a stack of things that basically happened. And to enumerate them, so back in the last election, the scandal that came up with Cambridge Analytica, where essentially they had done a thing that is the dream of a lot of marketers who want to sell a thing for money. Not sugarcoating it. A lot of people would love to be able to do that for non-nefarious ends, if you want to look at it that way. If I say, well, what we are doing right now, for example, with Facebook, is you may be able to go to Facebook and say, I really want to give this message to people who like peanut butter and work from home, or whatever it is, whatever the thing you're going to sell dog treats or something to people who work from home, I think have a dog and like, and Facebook now is much more close to the vest with that information. They'll say, all right, I'm not going to tell you who these people are, but you give me your ad and I'll give it to them. And I'll tell you how many people I gave it to, but I'm not going to tell you who they are. So you can't run away with this information and go seek them somewhere else, which I believe is probably the right answer for them. Before this, there were several difficult things where someone had got that information, that more specific information directly, and or ran a campaign to specifically target those people and very finely determine where they were politically, then essentially show them a version of the world by flooding them specifically with advertisements and links to new content pages and so forth, such that those people would specifically be brought into kind of a socio-intellectual funnel of these people's construction.
Yeah.
The reason why you can hear me wringing my hands about this is that it's difficult to define a line where once we are over the line, we've done a thing that's unethical. And this is a conversation I have routinely just to ensure that we are on at least what we believe to be an ethical and moral side of that line. Because you can imagine extremes, one of which is I say, I'm going to purposefully go and target, let's say I did something terrible. I'm going to say, I'm going to purposely go and target people who have high anxiety. I'm going to get, using my machine learning, influence, I'll get all the data that I can on what anxiety looks like. I'm going to try and make a model that will tell me if people have intense anxiety, and then I'm purposely going to serve them ads for a while that just intensify that anxiety before trying to sell them on my home security system. Now, that's pretty bad, right? Like it just on a moral level, the human animal like convulses a little bit hearing that. But at the same time, if I said, I want to find people who are already a little security minded, but don't have a system already, and say, hey, our system is the best. We know that you're looking to make sure your home is safe, so why don't you buy ours? Now, that doesn't sound so bad, but you see how the line is very blurry, right? Yeah. It's difficult for me to say on this side of the line, I've done a thing which is ethically unreasonable. And so right now, this is an intensely human question. Some of this happened during the election, during the last election, certainly, that people would say, operate in a way that if I phrased it in a different way, it wouldn't seem that bad. But the reality of it was people attempting to find the sort of socio-emotional holes in people's armor and hit exactly that spot such that they would become afraid and then start listening specifically to this piece of media. Is that wrong? I think on an intuitive level it is. But it's very difficult to enumerate. And so we have drawn a tentative line where services like Facebook and otherwise will say, I'm not going to give you full access to this information because I consider the full knowledge of what we know about everybody to be dangerous and or easily exploitable. So I will give you this person's, how enthusiastic they are about cars or whatever, my guess. They're running models constantly to try and pick this out, but I won't give you the people. I'll allow you to address those people through our platform, and you're paying for that as an advertiser, but I won't tell you who they are. That I think is a step in the right direction, and we're going to have to define as a culture a line that we don't step over, and that's very much a conversation we're having currently, and I'm having it here as the person who's sort of deepest technically in the AI space, probably.
Well, as a society, it's something that I think people are talking about these days, and there aren't really good historical guidelines. Like for most ethical problems, you've had people debating those ethical problems for hundreds or thousands of years. Whereas this is getting in some gray area, like you enjoy that people are able to advertise their arrows with padded arrowheads to you. I mean, that's a product you might want to buy, and that's a value for you. But when you get into intellectual stuff or elections or other sort of the democratic process, that's dangerous territory. And my conclusion was that as a society, we want both a functioning democracy and republic democracy as we have it now, and then also we want the belief in that, because the belief, at least in my mind, is just as important. Because if it works and people believe in it, that's great. If it works and people don't believe in it, that's terrible, because they have lost their faith and that will cause them to do things. If it's broken, people believe, that's also bad because you don't want people believing in a totally corrupt, amoral, broken system. But you've just got this, little quadrants there of like good possibilities, bad possibilities, and trying to make sure that we're aiming such that lowly technologists that we can aim society towards a moral, ethical, brighter future.
That's really well put. I mean, I think so. So that leads us to the question of which, if it is it broken, is it not broken? Do we believe it's broken? Do we believe it's not broken? In some sense, I just want to be on the diagonal of that. If it is broken, I believe that as a society we can have a referendum on that and rewrite the rules. I think we have the strength. It's hard and painful, but I think we could do it. If it works, I want I want it to work. I want everybody to be able to like vote, believe in their vote, believe it's really going the right place. So that strikes it. It's almost a determinism versus free will question. The real underlying question about this is not, are we going to see deep fakes in 2020 that show politicians as doing stuff they didn't do? I believe we probably will. I'll give that better than 50-50. Okay. It's not certain, but like I think we'll see a couple. We've seen a few shots across the bow in that arena already. Are we gonna, it's not, are we gonna see basically weaponized advertising that does its utmost to figure out where people are emotionally weak and drive a wedge specifically in that spot? We're definitely gonna see that. Just I don't even have to say anyone is necessarily bad. I only have to say at least a couple people will be, and they will get an edge by doing that, which is, but the question isn't, is that stuff going to happen? The question is, are people actually deterministic to the point where that is, if this were the Olympics, is that like an unreasonable performance advantage? If I have the ability to weaponize my advertising and say, I'm not just saying you like peanut butter and mine is the best. I'm saying I know the 3 keywords that make you always point your head up, and I'm going to use them first and then say buy my peanut butter. And it's going to actually hurt you a little bit because those things are like emotionally intense to you. But you're going to think about my peanut butter more than everybody else's peanut butter. It feels wrong. The question is, are we going to draw a line at some kind of platform / we've seen some, again, approaches with like GDPR in Europe, attempting to draw a line. Is it the right one? How do we do it without shutting down all advertising and that sort of thing? So the question to me, and this is a really interesting one, is about human nature, and I don't have an answer, is are we deterministic in that way? Does everybody have a spot where essentially I can slide an argumentative wedge in there and they have no resistance? And can I detect that spot using machine learning, and AI approaches? If both of the answers are yes, then we have to rethink how we do stuff like elections. And I don't have an answer for that. If it's not, and it's simply that advertising is going to get intense and we're going to have to respond to it by turning down the emotional volume on it, I think we can weather that. We're about to find out. And I hope that we do not find out in a way that damages us, our country, any other country, that sort of thing. But it's a difficult question. We're right at the tip of that happening. So we're going to find out, I think, in the next 2 years. The writing will be on the wall whether or not people are exploitable, if you like. Whether there's a backdoor in to people's heads and everyone has one and all you need to do is find it. Some people say yes. People who are big in social engineering say yes. People who are big into advertising hope that it's the case. And other people say no. People are basically rational, and you can throw crazy emotional nonsense at them, but in the end it won't actually hook them. I have personally seen evidence that both of those things are the case. So I guess all I can say is we're going to find out, and it is incumbent upon us as the techies. It's also incumbent upon everybody else to use their skills, whatever they have, to try to make us come out on the right side. If there need to be changes, we have to figure out what those are in a way that doesn't break a country or countries. And if it's not, then we have to make sure that we come up with a line about what you can know and what you can use about a person that maintains a limit on the ability to speak emotionally to individuals. Strangest thing in the world, right? But no,
I agree. It's an issue that I think it's a problem that we can either put our heads in the sand and try to pretend does not exist, or say, look, this is a problem. If you can't see it's a problem now, this will be a problem in 2, 4, 8 years. Certainly, it's going to be a problem. So what do we do about it? And at least starting the conversation now so that we have some good ideas, I think is a really positive step. Because the place you don't want to be is in that world and not having any good ideas about what to do about it.
Yeah, I on the hopeful side, because I've been a little bit unhopeful, that we have some tools and evidence that maybe this is going to come down on the good side if it works. And what I mean by that is, do you remember when I'm old enough to remember when pictures were believing?
Yeah.
When, if somebody would say, hey, here's a picture of the, this nominee for president, and that's them kicking a dog right there. And you go, wow, oh, that poor dog, this is terrible. I'm not going to vote for that person. And, nowadays, if somebody showed you that, you'd be like, oh, wait. It seems really unlikely that during the election season, anybody would do that. Let me take no, so let me look this one up, because I know that you can fake a person kicking a dog pretty well, especially if you want to put a little bit of expertise behind it. If you have somebody who's like near an expert, they can do that no problem.
Yeah.
I don't want to say no problem. I have every bit of respect for that skill set. I'm sure it's some problem, but they can do it. But right now, at least as of, let's say, 2015, video was believing.
Yeah.
We're coming through the eye of a second needle, which is the techniques that we have now. I work with a lot of these techniques myself, actually. Facial manipulation, alteration of either subtleties or gross aspects of an image, deep faking, and that kind of thing. It's at the forefront right now because it's so new. And so, we have Photoshop now, and everybody goes, oh, that's just Photoshop. I bet it is. Let me look it up.
Yeah.
At some point, people are going to have to start being like, oh, that's Videoshop. I bet that's so weird. I'm going to look that up because I think it's shopped. It's Videoshop, or whatever the new tool will be.
Yeah.
And we haven't quite gotten there. And I think that's part of the pain, is that, the other part of the pain, I think, is the difficulty in researching every little thing that comes up and fatigue around that point. So, images did it basically during my lifetime. Video's doing it now. Text did it at the dawn of time, as near as I can tell. You could always just say things that weren't true. But there are so many things that either are half-truths or are not really true, that the easiest thing that people can do is just ignore stuff that they kind of don't want to believe, which is the other half of this equation. So,
well, people do that all the time just to get through the day. I mean, I guess on the conversation on the nature of truth, you've seen psych studies and stuff done with, and if you have an incident, or you have 3 or 5 people at a party, and you interview them a week or a month later, and they can have vastly different narratives about how the party went on, or who snubbed who, or what the social dynamics were at that party. And so,
and you can even influence that behavior by like using different language when you ask. Did this person hurt that other person, or this person speak harshly to this person, or this person like attack
so
that
how harshly did so and so speak to so and so?
And you've primed the pump for them to say, oh, it was pretty harsh. You've implicitly defined a range. And so the fact that people are malleable in that way speaks more to this idea that, well, we're closer to automatons, and so we need a protective line where like you can't drive. There's a certain sharpness to a market wedge that you're allowed to get. Like that's one answer to this, is I just go, look, you can't get people who are this exact psych profile, because if you could get that, you could design a message that would go right in their subconscious, and it's not fair. You can only have a wedge that's so sharp. So this is the limit on information that you can have about people that you're talking to as a group. That's one answer. I think we're going to come to that answer. The question is how sharp. But since people are like that, it's going to be difficult because in text, everybody does this all the time. They just say, well, you told me politician X was kicking a dog. I really like politician X, so I don't believe it. And since you can find basically every opinion about everything everywhere, if I search for that, someone will say, no, it was fake.
Yeah.
And then, but it could have been just somebody, it could be real and somebody could just say it's fake. But now you have a whole string of people who hear them first and say, oh, no, it's fake. And now there's a giant population of people who say, no, we believe that to be fake. It's interesting because in a way that could be a protection against the sort of things we're talking about, which is, it's a funny thing to say, but bear with me. I'm just noodling this through.
Yeah, go for it.
It's possible that would imply a lack of malleability or a need for like a strong preponderance of evidence to change somebody's opinion, which is, normally you wouldn't think is a good thing. You think that we would be very responsive to good evidence about a thing. But in a sense, the thing that concerns me most, and I'm going to speak as somebody in computational modeling or models dynamics a lot. The thing that concerns me most is what I call the custom funnel problem, where, so if you're familiar, you probably are, maybe listeners aren't, with the idea of an acquisition funnel. The idea being, at one end, you have people who've just heard about your business or product. At the other end, you have people who actually bought your thing and have become a customer and maybe a repeat customer. And in the middle, there are a bunch of stages where people fall out of that funnel. Well, I've heard of your product, but it's not for me. So I just stay at the I know about you level. Okay, well, I'm excited about your thing because it is for me, but I don't know if I'm going to buy your thing, and etc. And there's a very fine gradation to this. So this is traditionally okay in some sense, that the beginning of that funnel has to be a certain size, because by nature people differ. And so even if you're dropping a pretty tight spotlight onto the market, people who just like peanut butter, have a dog, and work from home, it's still pretty big. All those people, some people vote one way, some people vote another, some people are old, some people are young, but they all, fall into this spot. So you say, I'm going to sell my peanut butter based dog product to these people. If you're allowed to shrink that all the way down and it becomes like an acquisition straw instead, focusing on this on like one person, a couple people who I know are exactly like this, and I give that to like an unscrupulous person and I say, you're just going to put this laser beam on these like 10 people, then what I can do is, and traditionally this would take a lot of money, which is which was the protection as near as I can tell. You could always call those people and hammer on them and like put advertisements right in the places where they're going, figure out exactly what they want to hear, talk to psychologists, get the best salespeople on it. And you could probably, by boiling all your, cash away into doing this with all these experts, move these people specifically over. And the thing that was protecting us is it cost a lot because it wasn't automated. So nobody would want to do that for 10 customers. The cost of customer acquisition would go through the roof. But if I'm allowed to do that in an automatic way, if the techniques that we're building now allow you to take a funnel and turn it into an acquisition straw, and now you have 1 million straws, each of which pointing at like 10 people, and I'm allowed to customize the messaging, if that is possible, it still somewhat remains to be seen how possible it is. Then I can take all those people and say, well, here's your political position right now. I want you over here. So I'm going to custom build a series of events for you that will bring you in this direction. I'm going to like flood you with an article that says a thing that's a half truth, but that you're attractable to, that will bring you a little more over here. And then I'm going to do it again and bring you a little more over here. And then I'm going to keep on trying to get you into a forum where a bunch of people who believe a slightly more extreme thing are. If I can custom do that, you could always do that, but it costs money. If that starts being near free, we're probably in trouble. And the protection against it is probably saying you're not allowed to use that, which is in some sense too bad, because there's a positive use for it too. If somebody's allowed to drop the thing right on me, they could say, hey, I know you really well. Here are the 8 products that would make you happiest. And I'd say, oh, thanks. That's better than me getting random products. And I don't really mind that you're advertising to me, but it is spooky. Because I can see right on the other side this nefarious use of like, I want to change your mind. I want you to believe things that I know to be untrue. I want to drag your political position in a direction that's favorable to me, and so forth. So the thing that I continually wring my hands over is how big.
Yeah.
That's happening now. It's always happening. We're not going to allow it to go to an absolute focus. How big a spotlight are you allowed to shine at one time?
Yeah.
And that is the hidden technical problem behind this stuff like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, or any of the additional sort of untruth. I'll say that there are sort of untruth engines out there.
Yeah.
And without directly pointing the finger at anybody, it's clear that there are people whose intent is to say a lot of things that they kind of know to be untrue, but that a lot of people are tractable to either drive ad revenue by having a lot of eyeballs on them, or to explicitly move stuff. And the idea of foreign investment or foreign, involvement in the elections is certainly an interesting can of worms too. I think it's one that I have less overt knowledge of. I know it's very difficult in a global environment to shut this down completely. On the other hand, we are clearly attempting to make a thing where the people affected by the laws are the ones that sort of have an underlying drive for them. So the idea of who gets to make the spotlight on the people, who gets to say those messages, are people outside the country allowed to say those messages? Are corporations allowed to say those messages?
Yeah.
Are churches allowed to say those messages? And we have rules about some of those, but some of them are just being hammered out. And I'm actually very hopeful for that one. I believe that we're going to find a happy medium, like we did with churches and worship organizations, where you say, if people go to church or synagogue or mosque or wherever you go, and somebody says, get out there and vote, for who you like the best. That's okay. But you can't say, and who you like the best should be this person because they're most in line with our values. And we've drawn that line. People skirt that line constantly, right? But we drew the line. Everybody knows sort of where it is. We're going to have to do that again with things like foreign involvement, because it's a very global market. And so at what point does, if I contract with a company to do marketing and half of their marketing team is in Moscow or whatever, are they now a foreign agency? If they contracted directly for specifics and they can show me the contract that went to Moscow, are those people now removed from being foreigners because they're acting under the sole influence of a U.S. You see what I mean? And that's much less my wheelhouse, but I know we're going to draw a line there. I think we have some already, and we're just not good at enforcing them. But 2020 is going to bring certainly a refocus on where those lines are, and that's probably for the best. I want us to be in the top, whatever it was, top left corner of our matrix where it works, and we know it works. But in order to stay there, we're going to have to draw those two lines. One, how tight of a funnel you're allowed to drop onto people to sell an idea, and then two, who's essentially allowed to speak to people who are the representing, or not the representing, who are the polis body. Who's allowed to talk to them about that election they're going to have. Those two things we need to come. Oh, and the third thing is people need to understand that there's now a video shop. It's a little tricky, and you have to have some specialized knowledge, but it exists across a myriad of platforms. So those three things: how big a spotlight, where do you draw the line about who can talk, and some education about how you can tell if a thing isn't real. If we manage to hit all those marks, I think we're going to be okay. If we fail significantly at even one of them, we do have a problem. If we fail at more than one of them, we have a serious problem. I wish I had better to say than that, but I want to remain hopeful about the outcome, and I think we can do it.
Well, I think the hope is that we can do it. The choice is in our hands, and we're not there yet. We're getting there, but I think we're having this conversation at a time where there's still the potential for the people who are working on these things and all of us to choose really which direction we're going in as a society. Because at least from my perspective, yes, the technologists have the power because they're the ones directly working on this, but the general public and every other section of society, which is, not the 2% of the people who work in technology and programming and stuff, they have a significant say, and they have a significant, however you want to put it, their dollars, their attention, even their public words. And I think that that's something that is really going to get out there. And you're already seeing people voicing their legitimate worries about these things, which is good that we're having the conversation now rather than in 8 or 10 years where it'll have been decided.
Much agreed. And the responsibility, I get a lot of your audience is probably sort of tech forward, tech focused as well. I don't know, but whether we are or aren't, we each of us carry a responsibility to bring our expertise to bear on this. If you are an engineering sort, for example, it's important to figure out where you stand on those issues. I could be wrong. There may be more points than those sort of 3 that I enumerated, but whatever you have to try to bring to bear on the problem, it's going to be important to be in the room where the conversation is happening. So in my case, I can very carefully say, here's how I would enumerate and quantify what I mean by big funnel, small funnel. And here is, to talk to policymakers, that's a distinction they may not get. I've been in around the sort of, digital marketing and analysis world a lot. So to me, it makes sense. I'm like, oh, here's a population. You have a subspace in that population that you're allowed to address at once. So therefore, there's an uncertainty, and we need to maintain the average uncertainty being bigger than a certain thing. That's going to bounce off a lot of policy people because it's hard to discuss in a way that doesn't get down to the weeds very quickly. So, we have a responsibility to be ready when that conversation happens and say, here's what I see. I see is the problem being that, people don't know that video can be like super fake now. So one of the things I think someone should do this is to actually, again, I'm an only way out is through, but optimism sort. So maybe there's like, my way would be just make it. Somebody should come out with that product, take all the good research stuff, glom it together, make it better over time, and put out a video shop, not so that there can be more explicitly, but because that will put absolutely the social nail in the idea that all video is real. People could point at it and go, no, they used this, I know it, and people are doing it constantly for fun, for
my brother could do that on his computer with his video shop. I mean,
So now all of a sudden people will be as removed from the immediate visceral interaction, and they can go and research things and figure out where they stand. We need to be sort of in the room where everything happens, because otherwise those things are going to be missed. The idea of it's okay to have a funnel that's this big but not this big, and the reason is because everyone has some emotional spots, and if you can find them, you can unfairly influence them. If that thing that we believe as society, I think I believe it, but belief is a strong word. I think I've seen it. If that's a thing we believe as society, we need to figure out how big the holes in people are. So therefore, we can figure out how big the wedge or how small the wedge is allowed to get. And that is a really fine point. People who are doing AI need to sit in a room with people who are doing psychology, who need to sit in a room with people who are doing marketing, who need to sit in a room with people who are doing policymaking. All of us got to be there, or we're going to make a wrong turn. And I want very much to see the right turn happen.
Yeah, as do I. So, Sean, thanks so much for your time, and thank you for this conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you as well. And as always.
All right.